Hi everybody, welcome to Missy's Imaginings. I have 3 different dolls here. One is a 3rd scale ball jointed doll. This is an island doll, Ada, and she has, I think, just a medium bust is what she's considered, small to medium. And she stands about, let's see, we'll measure her just so you have an idea here. She is, find the right measurement. Okay, you're looking at 24 inches or roughly 61 centimeter. I also have a toner Wild Imagination line, Evangeline. This is the plastic version. She is smaller, of course, than the 3rd scale, but she's larger than the typical 4th scale, so she's kind of a weird in between. She stands at 18.5 inches tall or 47 centimeters. Next I have the Toner Wild Imagination Eloine, who roughly is the average quarter scale. This doll stands at 16 inches or 41 centimeters. The body styles, not only are the heights different, but the body styles are very different. The Eloine has a very small bust. It's more of a flat teenage style bust, and her waist is not extremely indented. So beware, dolly nudity coming. They're going to be naked here for a minute. So as you can see in her body style, if it's not a doll with which you're familiar, she has a smaller bust and her waist is relatively straight from her rib cage, and then her hips are slightly larger. So she has a smaller bust style that is not that different from her waist measurement. The Evangeline, on the other hand, and I hope that this outfit hasn't stained her. It's lined with white, but you never know. It's been on her for quite a while. So we'll show off the difference in the Evangeline, who is very busty and has a more accentuated waist. So there we go. So you can tell that her bust is a lot bigger, and then the waist is smaller, then her hips come back out. So more of a mature figure. But I don't even like saying that, because you know a lot of mature people are shaped like this and a lot of mature people are shaped like this, so you know, whatever. But anyway, so that's the Evangeline. Still, even though her waist is more accentuated, she doesn't have the typical Barbie shape that is in the main Toner Tyler Wentworth line that has a very hourglass, definite hourglass figure like Barbie. But I don't have any of those right here. Then the Island doll is, like I say, she has more of a medium, small to medium bust. I would not say that's a large bust by any stretch of the imagination. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and design corsets for each of these body types. I'm going to start with a method that I've used before, and I use it when I'm making a basic set pattern. If you're new to the channel, I have several different basic sets for several different dolls that is drafted directly from the doll, and it's basically, if you sew it, you would get a really tight bodysuit. That's all you'd get. And the reason we have those is so you can draft your own patterns from a pattern that would fit your doll. So if you want puffy sleeves, you take the arm pattern and you make a puffy sleeve from that. It's just a guide, so you can start designing whatever you want to make. In the same sense that we use those basic pieces to design, we're going to do that again. So if you'd like to see how to do that, how to make a whole basic set, then I can put some links below to drafting a basic set pattern from any particular doll. The method will work with whatever doll that you have. So I wrap the doll with kitchen wrap, and then I use Scotch tape or cellophane tape to tape around the doll, and then I mark my lines on that tape, and then cut it off the doll. So I always wrap the doll in this first, so I'm not putting anything sticky on the doll. When we're making corsets today, there's a couple different styles that we're going to look at. The first one is typically what I have in several different outfits for dolls, and it's basically a really thick belt. So it goes around their waist and it laces up. That's about all it is. So this dress, for example, is sporting a red one, and I don't want my stand falling on the Elohim there, because it is metal. That probably wouldn't be good. But so it's just simply a fancy way to say a really thick belt. So it's several pieces that go around. I use grommets in the front and then lace it up. This is made of an ultra leather red vinyl, and so it looks like leather, faux leather, and it's not connected to the dress. It's a total separate piece. So here's one that fits the obitsu 50 centimeter. Then this one is pretty much just a straight on the front and the back. Then I've also done this type that's more pointed on the bottom and pointed on the top that fits the Evangeline. This is the resin version of this doll, but the outfit fits either one. And so this again has a smaller, but it's basically like a fancy belt, but it's just really thick. It goes all the way around. It's smaller in the back and then comes up in the front and pointed down, and then I use grommets and lace it up. So that's one type of corset that we'll do. It's the easiest one, the most basic one to do. So we'll maybe do that on this doll. Then on our more busty dolls, there's a different way, there's a couple different ways that you can make the full corset that covers the waist and comes up over the bust. And we're going to look at a couple of different ways that you can draft that pattern. So one will be using darts and the others will be using a curved seam that actually is formed to the curves of the doll. So we'll do both kinds, and that way you can have something, you know, that's an idea of what you want to play with, what you want to try. And when we're finished, all the patterns that we draw today, I'll go ahead and put on the website. But you might say, well, you drafted that pattern for this doll, but I want that pattern for this doll, and so you might have a little bit of work to do. But this way you'll know how to do it. So that's what we're going to do. So I will kind of switch up the camera so it's aimed more at the workspace. We'll do one doll at a time, get them wrapped and marked, and cut the pattern pieces off, draft them on the paper, and then I'll come back again to the camera when we're ready to actually start cutting and sewing. that I'm dealing with a corset, because I don't know what my corset design might look like yet, is I will take, and on this back I'm going to make it dotted. So this would be the center back of the corset, because remember, I'm going from the back to the front. My pieces are all lined up with the hemline in the same direction and the top of the corset in the same direction. So on my center back and my center front, I'm going to go ahead and make a dotted line, just to differentiate that from the rest of the pattern pieces. As far as, here we go, so we'll get that done. And then I'm going to indicate center front. Like this, and center back here. Okay, so now, when you have this done, the reason this comes into play, and if you're a sewer, obviously you're going to be ahead of me here and you're going to know this. If you're new to sewing and you're just starting out, if you're going to have a corset that closes in the back, so you're going to have buttons or snaps or whatever in the back, then you know that this front piece is going to lay on a fold. And so this is going to lay on the fold of the fabric, which will extend that out to look more like this once it's cut. So if I can get my piece there, there we go. So that you're going to have a wider piece, because you don't want a seam down the center if it's closing in the back. You want that to be pretty, where you can put your lacing across, or you can put rickrack or your design, but you don't want a seam just adding bulky seam allowance in the front for no reason. So you would fold the fabric and lay this piece on the fold, or even fold your paper over and make that an extended pattern piece to just cut it all at once. Then on the back, of course, you would have to extend those sides out past the seam allowance in order to have overlap for your closures, for your snaps or buttons, or however you're going to close that. If you want it just to be closing like one of these, let's bring them into play, like this, all you would need is the seam allowance, because you're going to be punching holes into the actual fabric and putting your grommets for your closure so that you can lace. But if you wanted to overlap with snaps or whatever for the back, you're going to have to extend that side. So that's why I say always mark the center back and the center front differently, because that will remind you when you're cutting your fabric, oh yeah, I'm going to close it in the back, so that means I need to go ahead and extend this piece, and I'm going to fold here, and you can write on fold. Or you can switch up your patterns and say, okay, now this time I'm going to go ahead and just have the back solid, and I'm going to close it in front. Then you would know that this is actually going to be the center edges of the front of your corset, and you're either going to punch here, or you're going to overlap for snaps or buttons, or however you want that closure to work. So that's just an idea when you're drafting your patterns. From here, I will go ahead and write the edges. My corset pieces are now all cut out, so I have all the pattern pieces cut out, and I've cut out the selections that we're going to sew today. So these are the Evangeline full over the bust pieces that we're not going to use. What we are going to put together is the under the bust corset for Evangeline, and I've used a brown faux leather, and this is the simplest one that we're going to put together. On the pieces, when I cut them out, I indicated the top of the piece, and if it's the back or the front, And also I indicated the little squiggle lines from the pattern pieces so I know which side is which, because they can be really tricky to decipher once they're cut out and there's no more markings. Also, be sure if you're using a faux leather and you just trace around the pieces, that once you trace one back piece, you be sure to flip that pattern piece over when you trace the other one, because you want them to be the opposite, because they're on opposite sides of the corset, of course. So just a little note, because I've done it the wrong way several times and had to recut pieces. The really cool thing about doing corsets for dolls is that the pieces are so small. It's an awesome way to use up scrap fabrics. So I've also cut out the pieces for the Evangeline. These are the under the bust pieces that we're not going to use. So her corset is going to be an over the bust corset, and because I'm using fabric here, this corset is going to be lined. Now I'm also going to have some fun with the front, so we'll get to that when we actually sew this one, but you can tell this is pleated and I have all these pieces cut out, so we'll get to that. So that one's ready. I'll set it to the side. And then for the third scale, these are the under the bust pieces that we're not going to use, and this is an over the bust corset that we're going to put together. So we're going to do a couple different ways to make the corsets as far as openings, some fun you can have. We're going to start with the most simple way to do a corset, and that is just sewing the pieces together. I chose the ultra leather because it will not fray. So the simple way, and this one I didn't even worry about making the back into one piece. I just cut the pieces out as they were. So what I'm going to do is to line up the pieces as they would appear on the corset. So the taller edge is the outside edge. There we go. And then the sides here and here, and then the back pieces here and here. So this is how the pieces will sew together. And I'm simply going to start at one side and go all the way and connect them. So when I lay them out on my workspace, I lay them out in the correct order so that I grab the right one and I sew the correct edges together. So that's what we're going to do to start. With all the top stitching done, now I want to go ahead and line this, because trying to fold these over is kind of difficult to get through the machine and make it look nice, and especially going around the corners. So I've trimmed the corners. I marked where the corner would be of the sewing line, and I've trimmed off the tips of that ultra leather just so there's not as much bulk when I go to flip it right side out. And because this ultra leather it kind of slips and grips under the machine, I'm just going to lay a piece that's big enough underneath it, and then I'll trim the fabric after I get it sewn on. And that way I just know that I'm going to have enough, because it tends to want to pull and tug, and you can get to the end and then not have enough fabric, because you don't want to pin this, because then you end up with holes in your ultra leather. So I'm just going to lay the fabric underneath. I am going to lengthen my stitch to about 3.5 on my Janome machine. And then I'm going to start at the center back, and it does grip a little going under this foot with this ultra leather. It's kind of sticky under there. So lengthening the stitch length helps, and then you might have to help guide a little bit once in a while underneath the foot. But we're going to have that fabric underneath for the actual presser or the feed dogs, so that's going to help. And I'm going to stitch just until I come to where that dot is that I made, and I'll maybe do that last one by hand. There we go. And then I turn it, and this way you can tell that this fabric is wanting to pull a little bit, but by not pre-cutting it, then even if it's a little puckered on the lining, I don't really care. But that way I'm not running out of fabric as I sew, and then end up with no fabric where I need to have lining. So now I'll go around the edge again. There we go. And it does want to kind of pull when I sew on here, and I think it's just that ultra leather pulling on the feed dogs, or not the feed dogs, I'm sorry, but the underneath side of my presser foot. So there we go. And then I'm going to leave a little bit of space. I'm not going to sew right to the end, because obviously I have to turn it right side out. There we go. Alright, so here my thread will mark, if I can get a hold of it, will mark where I started. So I'm going to stop about here and back tack, just so that I have some room to go ahead and pull that. There we go. Okay, so I back tack a little bit, so now I'm going to pull that out and cut my thread, and we'll look at both sides here so you can see how it does want to pucker that a little bit. So trying to hold that steady while you go under the machine, if you cut it the exact size, is difficult. I suppose if you're a lot more talented than I am, you can make it work and do it and say, oh, but Missy, I can do that really easy, and I am happy for you. But I cannot. So for me, it just works to cut a bigger piece and sew it on, and then trim as I go around. Now also, I'm not trimming the seam allowance way down to 1/8 of an inch, which on fabric sometimes I will before I turn it, because once I get this turned right side out, I do want to top stitch. And so I want to have, and I'll back up, because this is so light, I want to have enough bulk to turn that over effectively and top stitch more easily. So, but I did trim the corners, which I might trim a little bit more just on the corners, kind of trim up to that corner, and that'll help the tips of those pieces look nicer. There we go. And then sometimes it's nice if you trim just like a V cut inside here. That makes less rumple of your ultra leather trying to fit in once it's turned. So I will do some V snips between the seams, but I'm not even snipping right down to the stitching. I'm just kind of leaving a little bit of room. So I hope that showed. I kind of have to remember to get back in the view of the camera here. There we go. So just between those edges, except where I am going to turn it, where it's not sewn, I'm not going to snip there. And there we go. And then once I turn that, it just kind of gets rid of some of the ultra leather thickness, so that it will look nicer. So now we want to turn it right side out. Come down through the opening there, if I can find Okay, so now I'm going to fold in that edge where I didn't sew. And then when I top stitch that, I'll just top stitch that closed when I go around it. Okay, so here's the inside and the outside. So now I'm going to top stitch all the way around. Hopefully that won't be too big of a challenge. So all the grommets are in place, and with a leather look or ultra leather corset, I like to use leather twine or leather cord to lace them up. You can find that at Walmart, any craft store, with the jewelry stuff over there, because it's used a lot with beading and that kind of thing. So, and there's different weights. So this is just a thin leather cord that I like to use to lace it up. So there's the basic under the bust corset with a front closure and just a simple lining. That's all we did. So you put the pieces together, line it, flip it right side out, and put your grommets in and lace it up, and it's ready to go. And this one can have a more of an old world look. It looks great with the little shamrocks, right? But anyway, so that's how it looks when it's finished. So that's the Eloine under the bust. So the next one we're going to attempt will be the Evangeline, which will be a back closure. And I thought I'd have some fun with this one in that I wanted to just throw some pleats on the front. Now, I wasn't sure how long this would need to be, so I just grabbed a long piece of fabric and pleated it. Then, to kind of hold the pleats in place while I get ready, I just ironed on some fusible interfacing. So I did that next. The next thing I'm going to do is to get the front pattern piece. Here it is, and I'm going to lay it on the top at the edge. I'm just going to trace a line around the pattern piece. And like I say, there's probably more sophisticated ways to do this, but sometimes I just like to have fun experimenting with a project as I go. So I'm going to trace around the edges, and I'm going to actually sew just some, there we go, just some stay stitching to hold those pleats in place. So, and I have the brown fabric in there still, but that it won't matter, it's not going to show anyway. So I'm just going to go about 1/8 of an inch in, and let's see, we're going to clear out that, and I'm just going to sew just inside that pencil line, just enough to hold the pleating down, and then also it just kind of helps keep my fused interfacing in place. It does iron on, but it's nice just to give it a little bit of a stay stitch here. So now I'm just going to come up inside that pencil line to kind of hold my pleats in place, which I just thought would be kind of a fun thing to do. So there we go, and take it out there. Now, with that in place, I'm going to trim away everything I don't need. Oh, the sirens are going off, that's exciting. And I have my pattern right at the edge of that cream colored fabric, so I'm just going to cut the edge, and then I'm going to trim around this, which will be the front of my pattern piece, because this will have a back closure. So that's just an easy way if you want something a little bit fancy. Rather than trying to work with tiny little pieces, just keep your fabric large and do whatever it is you want to do, and iron it, you know, hold it in spot, and then do your cutting. And that way this is all ready to go ahead and sew in there, but I didn't have to work with any tiny little pieces to get it to work. So that's just kind of a fun way to get started. So we're going to go ahead and start on the Evangeline back closure. So now on the back closure, this is the normal back piece. So I'll hold it over here to show what I did. So I extended that out because I'm going to close the back with snaps. So I'll probably have a snap at the top, snap in the middle, and a snap at the bottom. So I wanted to extend that so that it would actually overlap and have room for my snaps to work. So I did that on the pieces. So I have a lining because I want this corset to be lined. So these are my lining pieces. And then on the corset itself, I thought, oh, let's have some fun. So on the front, we have the pleated front, of course. Now on this, you can actually do a dart here because it was still a little puckery from the taped pieces. There was a little bit of a pucker still left in this, so you can either make a dart to close that back up, or I'm just going to ease stitch or stay stitch with a larger thing and kind of pucker it just so I can ease it together. But I have cut 2 colors that match the front. Here we go. And I'm going to add some front fun to this pattern that will look like this. There we go. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn over this edge and hem it, and then I'm going to turn over this edge more and hem it. So I'm going to, and I'm just folding it in a kind of a straight line. I'm not going to worry about following the curve per se. I'm just going to fold that over so that the curve part is at right about 3/8 of an inch, and I'm just going to sew that. Just going to sew it straight all the way to the top. So I just kind of folded it over. There we go. So now this edge go like this. So now this one I'm going to fold over just a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch, or 3/8, I'm sorry. So about a 1/2 inch on this one. But on this one I'm going to sew very, very close to the folded edge. There we go. Out. And like I say, some of these you're just having fun, you know, just kind of experimenting as you go. So the first one was to hold that edge in place, and now this one looks like this. So what happens is then we end up with just a little bit of that the floral fabric showing through to the edge there. So that's how it's going to look on the front. And then I decide, do I like that? And I think, yeah, I think I do like that. So the next thing I want to do is I want to sew in some loops that will be fun for lacing. Makes just some little tiny loops on the front, and I'm gonna, there we go, so that just a little bit extends beyond that printed fabric. And I'm going to go along the seam line that I already put in. So I'm going to back tack, sew over it, and back tack because I want that to stay secure. Then I'm going to bring the ribbon down, leave my needle sunk, and sew down a ways. And hope that I'll have enough ribbon. Then I'm going to curve, holding that flat, and make another one, another little loop. That'll extend beyond the fabric there. And I'm going to sew, back tack, go down again. And it looks like they're about 1/4 of an inch apart. Do another one. You just kind of want to make sure you're not puckering the length of your corset piece. You know, you don't want to pull it so tight that your fabric's not laying flat. And do it again. And back tack and go forward. Go down. And another one. And you're just going to kind of go down all the way down to your fabric. That way it's all one piece, so you're not dealing with tons of little pieces of ribbon that tend to want to fray, and then you think, oh no, now it's going to pull out of my finished piece, because each time you're just creating a new loop with the same piece of ribbon. So here, when you get the ribbon sewn on, it looks like this, which is kind of wonky looking, but now we're going to lay this over the top like so. Matching up the edge, and we're going to get our front piece. So we're going to line up this onto the front piece with that curve of the original front. And now we're going to lay the green one on. Hope that I didn't get that too far down. Okay. And now I'm going to stay stitch this curvy edge to hold all my fabrics in place. And I'm just going about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the fabric, which will be inside the seam allowance when I'm done. And then I'm going to trim that corner edge off. So that now, this is what the front of my corset looks like. So then I'm going to take a piece of the green ribbon, and I'm just going to sew that down the front, like that. And then that will hold everything in place, so you'll still see all the colors, you'll see the pleating, and then my next one will be here on the same side, so I'll do the same thing on the same side, but then that will be on the front of my corset. So all those little layers and pleats and the little ribbons for lacing up for a decorative tie will all be in place. And yeah, so that's what I'll do. I'll go ahead and sew this down to hold everything in place, and then I'll do the exact same thing on the other side. So here's the front of my corset, how it'll look. So I've got the little double layers, and I've got the pleats, and I've got the little ribbon loops. So I've taken and lengthened my stitch a little bit, and I'm going to go ahead and pull on the top thread and just kind of add a little bit of pucker to this front edge that's the top kind of curve, just a little bit, not a lot, because I want to kind of help it have a little bit of a pucker to go around and meet the next piece that's going to be sewn on, which will be this piece, which will be on each side, and then we have the center or the back pieces that will be sewn on here. So because this is sometimes a little difficult to match up, I'm going to put the back side, the back and the sides together first, and then I'm going to also stay stitch or baste stitch around the curve of the bust here and here to kind of do the same thing, so that as I'm sewing those together I can kind of get them to fit a little better. And then I'll be taking a 1/4 inch seam, so I'm going to put the these pieces together here, and then I'll go ahead and attach these pieces to this front piece. So now that I have those pieces put together, I'm going to sew together my lining pieces, which are somewhere. I'll have to find where I put my lining pieces. They're just going to be of the cream color. They maybe fell off the back of the machine. But I'm going to go ahead and put the lining together, and then with right sides together, I'm going to sew the lining to the front, just like I did on the other one, holding everything, you know, in place, and then we'll flip it right side out. So that's our next step. So here is our finished corset. That's the over the bust Evangeline corset, and turned out pretty good. I'm very happy with that. It fits her really well. So it goes over the bust. There we go, and then we'll turn it around for the back. So here's the back. I have 3 snaps for a closure, so there was the exact amount of overlap that I wanted. So if you have an Evangeline and you want to make her a corset, there's a fun thing for you to try. The last method to make a corset is what's listed on the pattern as the dart method. So this is the one I did with the darts. Much of the layering is done the same way. You just kind of add whatever you want to add on it as far as notions and lace, whatnot. So I did a strip of lace down the center, and then added on a strip of this printed fabric just for a little touch of color, and attached my loops to that piece of fabric, put it on, then trimmed the edges with some gold, a little bit more lace back here. So that's how that one turns out. The pattern pieces will look like this, and I've cut out the darts just to make it easier to transfer that information to my fabric. And so this is just a way to do it if you're not comfortable with sewing those real curved seams around the bust. Instead of having that curved seam, you simply sew in a dart here and a dart here, and then 2 in the back where those seams would be. The other item that you would notice is I've just marked the actual center front and the actual center back. On this pattern, I just wanted to try it, so I cut it out as it was, and I went ahead and did a center seam. You don't see it because I have lace there, and then I actually just kept this seam in the back. I didn't add anything or change anything, and it does fit her really well, except she lost her wig. But other than, you know, losing her wig there, the corset worked really well, so I didn't have to adjust at all. There was enough overlap to add the snaps, just because I wanted that back closure. So that's just a way you can do this pattern. For what looks like the front closure, it's actually just kind of like a faux closure. You just make it look like however you want by adding, you know, a strip of fabric wherever you want it, and taking your loops on there and then lacing it up. So there we go. So that's the third method. And I also have the patterns for the Eloise and the Evangeline that are also included. So if you want to do one of these kind rather than all the piecing, it's a little easier. The only thing that you kind of have to watch for that can present a little bit of a difficulty is when you're placing all the embellishments, the rickrack, lace, whatever you want to add. In some places, like in the center, I put those on before I did this dart, just because once you put that dart in, it's going to give curve to the fabric. So it's going to be a little bit more difficult to get your embellishments where you want them sometimes if you don't take into account the fact that the curve of the fabric is there. So if you want to avoid that, then you would have to have real narrow finishings to place between those darts if you want to put the darts in later. So you just kind of have to factor that in depending on what kind of embellishments you're going to use. Just be aware that if you have something really thick and it's sewn here and you haven't put that dart in yet, it's going to be hard to put the dart in because now it's thick and bulky with your embellishments sewn on the outside. And likewise, if you put the dart in, it's going to change the shape of the fabric a little bit. So you have to kind of adjust for that. So that's kind of the only little thing that you'd have to watch for, but it is a little bit more straightforward in that you've just got this one pattern piece, and you can either place it on the fold here, or you can, you know, have a front opening and just have that be where you finish it. So it's just kind of less hassle because you're not having to make sure all your pieces are lined up. So there we go. So there's the yellow one using the dart method. And here is the last corset all finished. So once I got everything all pressed, I went ahead and laced up the front and then put the lining in. This again has 3 snaps down the back to close it in the back. So that's what the blue one looks like. And this is, like I say, a medium bust, 1/3 scale BJD. So it turned out really well. I'm really pleased with how all 3 fit. They pretty much fit really snug and really well, and no big surprises, which is nice. So anyway, yeah, that's how you can have fun with some corsets. It's mostly a question of how intricate you want to be, how much you want to pre-layer all your little pieces, because you need to fold over the edges so that you'll have a nice clean hem, and then you can just have fun with it. Layer where you want, however much you want, and then add in your little loops, or if you want to use the grommets, either way. So it's just kind of a matter of picking out your fabrics and a lot of tedious work. The big part is to mark your pieces so that you always know which is the top, which is the bottom, and which sides will actually be attached, because it's very easy to get those mixed up. And several times doing this one especially, I was double flipping and checking with my patterns because it was so dark that it was hard to see the markings that I'd made. So I was constantly double checking to make sure we had the right ones in the right place, but I was really tickled with how it turned out. And it comes up high enough so it looks nice and snug. There's different things. If you want to have more of a V-neck on it, you can adapt that on your pattern. So there you go. There's how to have fun with some corsets, different ways you can put them together, and I hope it was helpful. So if you liked it, go ahead and let me know in the comments, because I always enjoy reading the comments. And if you have any suggestions there for anybody else reading, then you can add those, and just things that you found in putting them together that might make it easier for someone else. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.